Hi, hello. How are you? It's so nice to see you again. My name is Eulith, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I would like to do another simple biology lesson with you. And as I'm sure you could tell by the title of today's video, our topic will be all about muscles. So as before, I will tell you a few basic things about muscles, and then afterwards I would like to do a little quiz, just in case you want to test your knowledge. Of course, you don't have to pay attention at all to this lesson. If you just want to listen and relax, that is also perfectly fine. So, without further ado, let us start with our lesson, shall we? Muscles may have an even more important role than you may be aware of, depending, of course, on your own knowledge about this stuff, because they do a lot more than just move your arms or legs or whatever else. And there's many muscles inside the human body, about 600 to 800 depending on how you count them. And typically speaking, these muscles get categorized into 3 different groups that have different functions and different structures, of course. And between those 3, you can again split them into 2 categories. One falls into one category and the other 2 fall into the other category. And the first category is voluntary muscles, and that belongs to the group that you are most likely most familiar with, which are skeletal muscles. And skeletal muscles, as the name implies, are connected to your bones via tendons, and together with those bones and tendons, and also something called ligaments, which connect bones together, they all function to allow movement that you can willingly control, hence the voluntary category. So, whether you are moving your arms or your legs, or sitting up straight, or perhaps, standing up, anything that you can think of that you can will in terms of movement is done by skeletal muscles, pretty much. That is not the only function, however, that the skeletal muscles have. They are also responsible for maintaining your general structure and, of course, for protecting what's inside of your body, because they are connected to your bones, and together they often form a protective shell around your internal organs. So that is our first group and first category. And the second category, which I'm sure you can guess, is involuntary. And involuntary basically means that you cannot consciously control these muscles. Instead, they are controlled by something called your autonomous nervous system, which is also part of your nervous system, of course, but you don't actively control it and you are not actively aware of these things the same way you would with your voluntary nervous system. At least for the first group that falls under this category, which are smooth muscles. Smooth muscles line quite a few of your internal organs and are responsible for several systems in your body. For example, maybe most famously, your digestive system, but also your respiratory system, your reproductive system, and your urinary system. But that would be a little bit too much for today to explain, so I'll just give you a quick example via the digestive system. Because most of the digestive system is made of those muscles, those smooth muscles, with a couple of exceptions, of course. And the primary role of the muscles that are part of your digestive system is to move along food, of course. And this movement is called peristaltic. And that is one way smooth muscles have a function inside of your body. Now, the other group of muscles that fall under the involuntary category is called cardiac muscles. And I'm sure you can guess, these muscles only exist in your heart, which makes them very, very special. And their function, of course, is to pump blood through your cardiovascular system. So through your heart and around your arteries and your veins and all of the really, really small blood vessels as well. And how they do that is actually really, really interesting, because there is a specific part in your heart which is called the sinoatrial node, or SA for short, which functions as a sort of pacemaker for your heartbeat. It sends out electrical impulses to stimulate a region of your heart muscles, so your cardiac muscles, and this stimulus then gets transferred over from muscle to muscle, kind of like a wave, until it reaches around all of the heart and back to your sinoatrial node. But that is just a little quick look into how the heart works, because I would like to explain that in more detail in another lesson. So now we know about the 3 different kinds of muscle groups that exist inside of your body. And next, I want to, of course, explain a little bit about what muscles are made of and how they work in very simple terms. Now, let's take a muscle and look a little bit closer, and then we can see that this muscle is actually made out of bundles of muscle fibers that are encased by connective tissue, and this is called a fascicle. If we look even closer at the muscle fibers, we can see that these muscle fibers are singular long cylindrical cells that contain multiple nuclei or cores, so cell cores. And if we look even closer, we can see something called a myofibril. And the myofibril contains the actual things needed for contraction. Now, skeletal and cardiac muscles have something called a sarcomere, and sarcomere is the actual functional unit of the myofibrils. On the smallest scale, or the almost smallest scale, I suppose, that is used for the contraction is something called a myofilament, because it contains proteins, and these proteins are, among others, myosin and actin. And now that we know about those, I can explain to you how a muscle contracts by using skeletal muscles as an example. So, as pretty much everything in the body, the start of a muscle contraction is a signal coming from your brain, so an electrical impulse. And that electrical impulse in turn causes calcium to be released in the cell from its storage, and that calcium binds to other proteins that guard something called a binding site on the actin protein. And the binding site, as I'm sure you can imagine, is used to bind something onto the actin. And the something that binds onto the actin is the myosin. And this requires, of course, like most things, energy. And what that does in turn is the myosin that is bound to the actin bends a little bit and pulls the actin closer, which of course means that the muscles contract. Of course, the muscles have to relax as well, and the principle for that is pretty much the same but in reverse. The signal, of course, the electrical impulse ends, and therefore the calcium that has been released gets returned to its storage, which means that the guarding proteins are no longer prevented from guarding the binding site of the actin. And additionally, ATP, which is the most important energy source inside the human body, binds to myosin, and myosin lets go of actin. And then, of course, through that, things return to their original position and the muscles relax. I hope that you now know a little bit more about muscles. And we're gonna do our little quiz now to check if that is indeed true. So I'm going to be asking you 3 little questions, and then of course I will tell you what the answers are afterwards, alright? So let's start with the first question. Which muscle group can you control willingly? The muscle group that you can control willingly or voluntarily are skeletal muscles. I hope that you got it right, but it's okay if you don't, of course. Then for our second question, perhaps, can you tell me 2 systems in the body where smooth muscles play a very important role? So, the examples that we covered for systems in the body that use smooth muscles are the digestive system, the urinary system, the respiratory system, and your reproductive system. So if you picked 2 of those, you get a point. And lastly, can you tell me what the names of the 2 proteins that are actually involved in muscle contraction are? So the most important ones, because there are of course others, are myosin and actin. Let me know how many of your 3 little quiz questions you got right. So that will be all from me today. I hope that you enjoyed the video and that you learned a little bit about muscles. And even if you didn't, if you already knew or you weren't interested in learning, I hope that this video was still very relaxing, and I hope to maybe see you for our next lesson. So, I really wish you some amazing rest, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.